Co-Pilot Podcasts. Freddy Krueger's glove is sitting in Jason Voorhees' basement. Not as a prop, not as a joke, as a canonical anchor point for an entire shared horror universe that spans from the year 1300 all the way to the year 2455. Today, we're mapping the slasher universe chronology across the major horror franchises, specifically how the genre's three eras connect, how Halloween, Friday the 13th, and A Nightmare on Elm Street are actually linked by cause and effect, and what the fan-built slasherverse actually is, and why Hollywood legally cannot replicate it. By the end of this episode, you'll be able to read a slasher movie not just as a standalone film, but as a piece of a much bigger, wilder puzzle. I've got someone here who has gone deep into this lore, so let's get into it. Walk me through where this whole thing actually begins.
So the first thing you have to settle is a debate that the slasher community has been having for decades. What is actually the first slasher film? And the answer depends entirely on how strict your definition is.
Right, and I feel like everyone just defaults to Halloween, which, spoiler, is not the right answer.
Not even close. According to Wikipedia's entry on slasher films, critics actually trace the genre's roots back to psychological horror films like Peeping Tom and Psycho, both from 1960, as well as the Italian Giallo films. So if you're being generous with the definition, the slasher genre is over 60 years old.
60 years. That's wild. But there's a camp that pushes back on that, right?
Yeah, and no film school actually laid this out really well. There's a divide in the community. One side says Psycho and Peeping Tom count. The other side says the genre really starts with 1974's Black Christmas and then 1978's Halloween. The argument is that those earlier films don't fit the specific mold tightly enough.
So what is the specific mold? Like, what actually makes something a slasher versus just a horror movie with a knife in it?
So Wikipedia and Paste Magazine both have really useful definitions here. A slasher film involves a killer stalking and murdering a group of people, often with bladed or sharp tools. But the key thing Paste points out is that slasher villains are human beings, or were human beings at some point. The fear is specifically that killers walk among us. That's what separates it from, say, Alien or The Terminator, which have similar structures but non-human antagonists.
That's actually a really clean line. It's the human element that makes it a slasher.
Exactly. And then there's a formula that Wikipedia describes. A past wrongful action causes severe trauma, which gets reactivated by some kind of anniversary or commemoration, and that's what re-inspires the killer. Think about almost every major franchise, and that formula holds.
Michael Myers, Jason, Freddy, they all have that origin trauma thing going on.
Every single one. And then you've got the recurring tropes that no film school catalogued. The central masked or disfigured killer with a personalized weapon, victims who are typically young adults killed off one by one, the final girl who survives, the elaborate kill set pieces, and characters making genuinely baffling decisions like splitting up.
The splitting up thing. Every time.
It's load-bearing to the genre at this point. But here's where it gets really interesting structurally. Wikipedia actually divides the entire slasher canon into three distinct eras. The classical era runs from 1974 to 1993. Then you get the self-referential era from 1994 to 2000, and then the neo-slasher cycle from 2000 to 2013.
Wait, so Scream is literally its own era? That tracks...
Scream in 1996 basically defines that whole self-referential bracket. And within the classical era, Wikipedia identifies a golden age specifically between 1978 and 1984. That's the 6-year window where Halloween, Friday the 13th, My Bloody Valentine, Sleepaway Camp, and A Nightmare on Elm Street all came out.
6 years. That's an insane concentration of iconic horror.
And what's fascinating is that those three biggest franchises from that era, Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare, didn't just happen in parallel. According to the analysis on 20-Sided, each one directly caused the next to exist.
Oh, okay. Break that down, because I think people assume they just all showed up around the same time by coincidence.
So the 20-Sided piece is really detailed on this. Halloween in 1978 is described as arguably the first modern slasher, not the first slasher, but the first modern one, because its existence and success directly inspired Friday the 13th. And then the success of both of those films subsequently prompted the creation of A Nightmare on Elm Street. It's a chain reaction.
So it's like a domino effect. Halloween falls, Friday the 13th falls, Nightmare falls.
Exactly. And Halloween itself has this almost accidental origin. According to 20-Sided, producer Irwin Yablans believed there was untapped potential in the horror marketplace after the success of The Exorcist in 1973. He and his financier came up with the concept of a faceless, unstoppable killer murdering babysitters on Halloween night, and then they brought in John Carpenter to direct after seeing his film Assault on Precinct 13.
So Halloween was basically a business decision first, a creative vision second.
And here's the part that gets even more interesting. 20-Sided notes that Carpenter likely formed the basis of his Halloween plot after asking director Bob Clark what he would do as a sequel to Black Christmas, the 1974 film. Clark had zero intention of making that sequel and had no ownership of the ideas he shared. But those ideas apparently fed into what became Halloween.
So Black Christmas accidentally gave birth to Halloween, which gave birth to Friday the 13th, which gave birth to Nightmare on Elm Street. The whole big three is basically one long chain of borrowed inspiration.
That's a really accurate way to put it. And 20-Side is careful to point out that the big three, Halloween, Friday the 13th, and Nightmare, should be recognized as significant and important. Their longevity proves that, but they were not the first in almost any regard.
Which brings us to the really wild part of this conversation. The idea that all of these franchises might actually exist in the same universe. Like, not just thematically connected, but literally sharing the same fictional reality.
Yeah, and this is where we get into the slasherverse, which is, and I want to be precise about this, a fan-built meta-fictional construct. According to the Shapes Encyclopedia on the slasherverse, it seeks to reconcile the often contradictory histories of horror's most famous antagonists.
Okay, so what's the actual premise? Like, what are they claiming?
The core premise, according to the Shapes Guide, is that the events of Halloween 1978, Friday the 13th 1980, A Nightmare on Elm Street 1984, Child's Play 1988, and the Texas Chainsaw Massacre 1974 all occur within the same physical and temporal reality. Same world, same timeline.
Michael Myers and Leatherface are neighbors, essentially.
In the same universe, yes. And the slasherverse isn't just vibes, it's built on what the Shapes Guide calls connective tissue from official crossovers. The two biggest anchor points are the 2003 film Freddy vs. Jason, which is an actual studio-produced crossover, and the appearance of the Necronomicon Ex Mortis from Evil Dead in Jason Goes to Hell, The Final Friday.
Wait, the Necronomicon from Evil Dead shows up in a Friday the 13th movie?
It does. And that's treated as a canonical anchor point connecting the Evil Dead universe to the Friday the 13th universe. And then there's the detail that started this whole episode, Freddy Krueger's glove sitting in the basement of the Voorhees house in Jason Goes to Hell. According to the Shapes Guide, that's treated as the canonical anchor point for the entire supernatural branch of the universe.
So that one prop in one scene is doing a massive amount of lore work.
Enormous lore work. And the fan community has expanded on these official touchpoints into something called the Earth 818793 timeline. That's the actual designation the Slasherverse community uses. Earth 818793, also referred to as Earth Space 777.
They gave it a multiversal address. That's commitment.
Full Marvel level commitment. And the Earth 818793 timeline categorizes events into 4 continuities: the original, the new, the radical, and the insane timelines, specifically to account for all the reboots and retcons that happen when you have franchises running for decades. The Comic Board Slasherverse thread, which has been running since January 2024, lays this out in detail.
Okay, so how far back does this timeline actually go? Because you mentioned the year 1300 in the intro.
So, the Slasher Universe fandom's chronology of films is genuinely staggering. According to that wiki, the timeline starts in the year 1300 with the epilogue of Evil Dead 2 and Army of Darkness. Then it moves through 1955 with the Leatherface prologue, 1960 with Psycho, 1963 with the Halloween prologue, 1973 with the Texas Chainsaw Massacre, and so on through the decades.
And it goes forward in time too, right? Like, way forward.
All the way to the year 2455, which is when Jason X is set. So the Slasherverse timeline spans over 1,000 years of in-universe history. Jason Voorhees is literally in space in the 25th century within this continuity.
Jason in Space is a real movie that exists, and I think about that a lot.
It is very real. But what's interesting about the Slasherverse project is how it handles the connections between franchises. The Shapes Guide describes what they call Easter egg analysis, finding in-universe details that link the films together, sometimes intentionally, sometimes not.
What's an example of one that might not have been intentional?
The biggest one is Dr. Sam Loomis in Halloween. According to both the Shapes Guide and the Comic Board Slasherverse thread, the character shares a name with a character from Alfred Hitchcock's Psycho. The community treats this as evidence that the two films share a lineage, that they exist in the same continuity. The comic board notes this was likely unintentional, but in the Slasherverse it's treated as canonical.
So they're essentially reverse engineering a shared universe out of coincidences and Easter eggs.
That's exactly what's happening. And the comic board thread also points out something really interesting about why the creative teams behind these films might not even be aware of the shared universe. It's because the rights belong to different companies. Not every filmmaker is going to know or care about the connections fans are drawing.
Which raises the obvious question, why hasn't Hollywood just made this official? Like, if the fans have already built this whole thing, why isn't there an official slasher cinematic universe?
And this is the part that I think is genuinely fascinating. According to the Shapes Guide, the reason is purely legal. Blumhouse, New Line Cinema, and Paramount Pictures each hold separate copyrights to the individual franchises. That makes an official, all-encompassing cinematic universe legally very difficult to produce. The fan-led Slasherverse has filled that vacuum precisely because fans don't have to negotiate licensing deals.
So the most complete version of the slasher shared universe exists because of copyright law, not despite it. The studio's inability to cooperate is what gave the fans the space to build something more ambitious.
That's a really sharp way to frame it. And the Slasherverse did get a visual, dramatized version, the Slasherverse TV miniseries in 2022, directed by Rick Montgomery Jr., according to the Shapes Guide. It featured actors like Bailey Weaver and Zoe Quinn and acted as a tribute to the concept, dramatizing the intersections of these killers.
So the fans didn't just write a wiki, they actually made a show.
They made a show, and the reception within the horror community has been overwhelmingly positive, particularly among what the Shapes Guide calls lore hounds, people who enjoy the challenge of chronological synchronization. That's a very specific kind of horror fan.
Lore hounds. I love that term. These are the people who will spend 3 hours watching a YouTube deep dive on the Friday the 13th timeline.
And those videos exist. The Haddonfield Registry on YouTube has a playlist called Ultimate Timelines that includes a 3-hour-plus definitive lore-accurate Friday the 13th franchise timeline. Their Friday the 13th deep dive has pulled nearly 95,000 views.
95,000 people watched a 3-hour video about Jason Voorhees' timeline. That's a community.
That's a very dedicated community. And it points to something that the academic side of this has also noticed. The book Horror Franchise Cinema, published by Routledge in 2022 and edited by Mark McKenna and William Proctor, specifically addresses what it calls critical neglect toward horror film franchising. The book covers the forces and factors governing franchise development from the 1930s to the present day.
So there's actual scholarly attention being paid to this now.
From Routledge, which is a serious academic publisher. McKenna is a lecturer at Staffordshire University and Proctor is a principal lecturer at Bournemouth University. The book covers Texas Chainsaw Massacre, Nightmare on Elm Street, and the broader history of horror franchising as legitimate subjects of film studies.
I want to go back to something for a second. The Slasherverse fandom chronology has some really specific dates in it. Like, it's not just the 1970s, it's August 18th through 19th for the Texas Chainsaw Massacre. Who is doing that level of work?
The Lorehounds. And the fandom wiki's chronology is genuinely meticulous. It places the Friday the 13th films in July of 1984, Part 2 on July 12th through 14th, Part 3 on July 14th through 16th, and the final chapter on July 16th through 18th. So those 3 sequels happen across about 6 days in the same summer.
6 days. Crystal Lake had a very bad week.
A catastrophic week. And what's interesting is that the Slasherverse also has to account for the Nightmare on Elm Street timeline running alongside Friday the 13th. According to the fandom chronology, A Nightmare on Elm Street is placed in March of 1981, and then the sequels run through the late 1980s and into 1999 with Freddy's Dead.
And then Freddy vs. Jason in 2003 is where those two timelines officially collide.
September 2003, according to the fandom chronology. That's the moment the Slasherverse treats as the official crossover event, the point where the two biggest supernatural slasher franchises are unambiguously in the same world.
And the Slasherverse fandom wiki also has this interesting structure of multiple continuities. The original, new, radical, and insane timelines. What's the difference between those? So the Slasherverse wiki on Fandom breaks it down this way. The original continuity contains most of the original movies, graphic novels, comics, and novels that are canon in their respective franchises. The new line, House of Horror continuity, contains the remakes. The radical timeline contains graphic novels, comics, TV shows, and novels that are non-canon in their respective franchises, things like Jason vs. Leatherface. And then there's the insane timeline for the most out there material. So they've essentially built a multiverse to handle all the reboots and retcons, which is honestly the only logical solution when you have franchises that have been running for 40 plus years.
It's the only way to make it coherent. And the Comic Board's Slasherverse thread makes a really good point about this. Not every creative working on these films is even aware of the shared universe, because the rights belong to different companies. So you get accidental connections and contradictions baked in from the start.
Which is kind of beautiful in a chaotic way. The shared universe exists in spite of the studios, not because of them.
And the Comic Board thread also highlights some of the more creative connections fans have drawn. For example, A Nightmare on Elm Street was canonically turned into a film within the show Freddy's Nightmares. And Seed of Chucky features the production of a film called Chucky Goes Psycho, with an identical variant of Jennifer Tilly, the actress who plays Tiffany Valentine. So the Slasherverse even has to account for films within films.
That's a level of meta-textual complexity that I was not prepared for today.
The Slasherverse wiki on Fandom actually categorizes this into what they call the actors plane, which contains all movies that featured actors of the Slasherverse, more like Scream than Seed of Chucky, and the Chucky Goes Psycho plane, which contains all the fictional movies featured within Slasherverse movies. It's layers within layers.
Okay, so stepping back from all of this, what does it actually mean that fans built something this elaborate? Like, what does the Slasherverse tell us about how people relate to these franchises?
I think it tells us that the slasher genre has always been about more than individual films. The Shapes Guide describes the reception of the Slasherverse as overwhelmingly positive among lorehounds who enjoy the challenge of chronological synchronization. That challenge is the point. People aren't just watching these movies, they're treating them as a puzzle to solve.
And No Film School made this point that slasher movies are basically whodunits with high body counts. There's always been a puzzle-solving element to the genre.
Exactly. And the Slasherverse takes that puzzle-solving instinct and scales it up to an entire interconnected universe. The same impulse that makes you want to figure out the killer in a single film makes you want to figure out how all the killers fit together across 50 years of cinema.
There's also something kind of counterintuitive here. The fact that these franchises are so messy, so full of reboots and retcons and contradictions, is actually what makes the Slasherverse project interesting. If the timelines were clean, there'd be nothing to reconcile.
That's a really sharp observation. The messiness is the feature, not the bug. And the academic work on this, Horror Franchise Cinema from Routledge, frames it as studying the forces and factors governing franchise development. The contradictions and retcons are part of that development, not failures of it.
So here's what this really comes down to. We started with Psycho in 1960, or maybe Black Christmas in 1974, depending on who you ask. And we end up with a fan-built universe that spans from the year 1300 to the year 2455. With multiple continuities, a multiversal address, and a TV miniseries. That's a remarkable arc for a genre that started with a shower scene.
And the through line from that shower scene to Earth, 818793, is actually pretty traceable. Psycho influences the genre produces Halloween produces Friday the 13th, Friday the 13th produces Nightmare on Elm Street. Those franchises cross over officially in Freddy vs. Jason, and fans use that crossover as the foundation for a universe that pulls in everything from Evil Dead to Child's Play to Hellraiser.
And the studios can't replicate it because of copyright law. So the most complete version of the slasher universe is the one that exists outside of any studio's control.
Which is maybe the most horror-appropriate outcome possible. The thing the studios created got away from them and took on a life of its own. That's basically the plot of every franchise in the Slasherverse.
The Slasherverse itself became a slasher villain. Unstoppable, impossible to contain, keeps coming back no matter what you do.
You can't kill it. You can reboot it, retcon it, hand it to a different studio. It just keeps going. The fandom chronology is still being updated. The comic board thread has 61 pages. The Haddonfield Registry is still making timeline deep dives. It's alive.
So the next time you sit down to watch Halloween or Friday the 13th or Nightmare on Elm Street, you're not just watching a horror movie. You're watching one chapter of a 1,000-year story that started in the year 1300 with the Evil Dead and ends in the 25th century with Jason Voorhees floating through space. And somewhere in the middle, Freddy's glove is sitting in Jason's basement, holding the whole thing together.
That glove is doing more narrative work than most entire film franchises.
Thanks for joining us on Copilot Podcasts. Go watch something scary tonight, and this time, pay attention to the Easter eggs.